13. Hannibal crossed over into Samnium from the territory of the Hirpini. He laid waste the agricultural land of Beneventum, took the city of Telesia, and deliberately provoked the Roman commander, hoping to infuriate him with all the humiliation and suffering he inflicted on the allies, and bring him down to a battle on level ground. Large numbers of Italian allies had been taken prisoner by Hannibal at Trasimene and subsequently released. These included 3 Campanian knights, who had been bribed with numerous gifts and promises from him to enlist the support of their compatriots for his cause. These men now informed him that he had an opportunity to capture Capua if he brought his army into Campania. This was too important a step to take just on the recommendation of these men, and Hannibal hesitated, fluctuating between trust and distrust. Finally, however, they convinced him to make for Campania from Samnium. The 3 men he let go after warning them to strengthen with actions their repeated promises, and ordering them to return to him with more of their people, including some prominent citizens. He then instructed a guide to take him into the territory of Cassinium. He had been told by people familiar with the area that by seizing control of the pass there, he could prevent the Romans from getting through to bring help to their allies. But the Carthaginian speaker has difficulty in pronouncing Latin names, and this made the guide hear Casilinum rather than Cassinum. He branched off from the correct path and went down through the territory of Eliphi, Caiadia, and Cales into the plains of Stellus. There, Hannibal looked around and saw the area enclosed by mountains and rivers, and so he called the guide and asked where on earth he was. It was only when the guide declared that Hannibal would lodge that day at Casilinum that the mistake became clear, and Hannibal realized that Cassinum was far off in another direction. He had the guide flogged and crucified to immediate the others. He doesn't immediate anyone. Hold on here. He had the guide flogged and crucified to intimidate the others, established a fortified camp, and set Maharbal and his cavalry to raid the territory of Falernum. The raid extended all the way to the baths of Sinussa, the Numidians causing enormous damage and spreading panic and fear even further. But even intimidation on the scale, with the whole country aflame with war, failed to shake the loyalty of the Allies. That was evidently because the authority to which they were subject was just and tolerant, and they did not refuse obedience to a superior people. The only real bond of loyalty. 14. Hannibal's camp was now pitched at the river Volturnus. The most beautiful countryside of Italy was going up in flames. Farmhouses were burning and smoking, and meanwhile Fabius was marching along the heights of Mount Massicus. At this point, mutiny almost flared up again amongst the troops. For a few days they had been silent. The column had been taken along at a faster pace than usual, and they had believed the object of the speedy advance was to keep Campania from enemy depredations. But now they came to the last heights in the range of Mount Massicus, and the enemy were before their eyes, torching the buildings in the Falernian fields and those of the colonists at Sinussa. and there was still no word of combat. "Have we come here as spectators?" asked Minucius. "To enjoy the sight of our allies being butchered and their property burned? Even if we feel no shame before anyone else, do we not at least feel it before these fellow citizens of ours, these men whom our fathers sent to Sinussa as colonists to make this area secure from the Samnite foe? But now it is not the neighboring Samnite who is putting it to the torch, but the Carthaginian from abroad, who, thanks to our indecision and inertia, has made his way here from the very ends of the earth. Ah, is this how far we fall short of our forefathers? They felt that it disgraced their empire to have Punic ships at large along their coastline. And now we see the coast filled with our enemies and taking over the Numidians and Moors. Recently we protested against the blockade of Saguntum, appealing not only to men, but also to treaties and the gods that protect them. And now we happily watch Hannibal scaling the walls of the Roman colony. The smoke from burning farms and fields comes blowing into our eyes and faces. Our ears ring with the weeping and wailing of our allies, who invoke our aid more often than they do heaven's. And here we are, hidden in clouds and forest, leading our army like a flock of sheep through summer pastures and along remote trails. Imagine if this was how Marcus Furius had proposed to recover the city from the Gauls, by trailing over hilltops and mountains, passes, and the way this latter-day Camillus, this superlative dictator that we have chosen in our hour of need, is attempting to recover Italy from Hannibal. In that case, Rome would now be in the hands of the Gauls. So many times did our ancestors save it. But if we keep delaying like this, I fear that they may have done so only for the benefit of Hannibal and the Carthaginians. But no, Camillus was a hero and a true Roman. On the day that the news was brought to Veii that he had, on the authority of the Senate and at the bidding of the people, been appointed dictator, he came down into the plain, even though the Janiculum was high enough to let him sit and watch his enemy. And on that very day, in the city center, the site of Gallic graves today, and on the following day, the site of Gabii, he cut down the Gallic legions. And remember how years later we were sent beneath the yoke of our Samnite foe at the Caudine Forks. How was it that Lucius Papirius, Cursor, took the yoke from Roman necks and set it upon the arrogant Samnite? For heaven's sake, was it by ranging the hills of Samnium, or was it by attacking and blockading Luceria, and giving the victorious enemy no rest? More recently, what other than speed of action gave victory to Gaius Lutatius? The day after he caught sight of the enemy, he crushed their fleet, then laden with supplies and encumbered by its own equipment and weaponry. It is idiocy to believe a war can be won by sitting around or making vows. One has to seize one's arms, go down to the plain, and engage the enemy man to man. It was daring and action that enhanced the power of Rome, not policies of inertia like this that only cowards call cautious. Tribunes and Roman knights would crowd around Minucius as he made these comments, like a public orator in action, and his swaggering comments even made their way to the ears of the common soldiers. Had the matter depended on a poll of the men, they made it quite plain that they would have chosen Minucius as their leader over Fabius. 15. Fabius had his eyes on his own men as much as on the enemy, and he first of all showed them that he could not be cowed by them. He well knew that his delaying tactics were now discredited in Rome as well as in the camp, but he drew out the rest of the summer, sticking resolutely to the same plan of campaign. The result was that Hannibal was deprived of any hope of the engagement which he had made every effort to bring on, and he began to look around for a site for winter quarters. The region he was now in could provision him for the season, but not indefinitely, for it was a land of fruit trees and vines, with all its cultivation given over to fruits that were delicacies rather than basic foodstuff. This was reported to Fabius by his scouts, and Fabius was quite sure that Hannibal would go back by the same passes he had used to enter Falernian territory. He accordingly secured with small garrisons Mount Calicula and Casilinum, a town that is cut in two by the river Volturnus, and marks the boundary between Falernian and Campanian territory. He then sent Lucius Hostilius Mancinus out with 400 allied cavalry to reconnoitre, while he personally led the army back by way of the same heights. Fuck, he sure loves that fucking word, doesn't he? Reconnoitre. Gives me a fucking hard time when I'm reading. Anyway, Macinus had been amongst the crowd of young men listening to the master of horses' ranting diatribes. He at first went forward as scouts do, trying to spy on the enemy from a secure vantage point. But then he caught sight of some Numidians roaming at large through the villages, and when the opportunity arose, he actually killed a few of them. Fabius had ordered him to advance only as far as he could with safety, and to fall back before he could be seen by the enemy. But suddenly, Mancinus' thoughts were focused on battle, and the instructions of the dictator slipped from his mind. The Numidians, some charging, some giving ground, lured him on almost to their very encampment, tiring the Roman horses and their riders. Then Carthalo, supreme commander of the Carthaginian cavalry, bore down on them at a gallop, routing them even before they came within javelin range, and maintaining a non-stop pursuit for about 5 miles. Seeing that the enemy was not abandoning the chase, and that he had no hope of escape, Mancinus encouraged his men and turned back to give battle, though he was outclassed in all respects. As a result, the commander himself and the elite cavalry troops were surrounded and killed. The others made off in scattered flight, escaping first to Callus and then by almost impassable trails to the dictator. It so happened that this was the day on which Minucius had rejoined Fabius. He had earlier been sent by the dictator to secure with a garrison the pass that contracts to a narrow gorge above Terracina, and which overlooks the sea. The object was to deny the Carthaginian access to Roman territory from Sunessa by the Appian Way. The armies now joined up, and the dictator and his master of horse encamped down on the path that Hannibal was going to take. The enemy was 2 miles away. 16. The following day the Carthaginians filled the entire road between the two camps with their column. The Romans had stationed themselves directly in front of their own rampart. clearly in a more favorable position. But Hannibal nonetheless moved forward with his light infantry and cavalry to challenge his enemy. The Carthaginians attacked at several points, charging and then retreating, but the Roman line remained in position. It was a sluggish battle, more satisfying to the dictator than Hannibal. Casualties numbered 200 on the Roman side and 800 on the enemy's. Hannibal then seemed to be cut off, since the road to Casilinum was blocked. Capua, Samnium, and large numbers of produce-rich allies to their rear could provision the Romans, but the Carthaginians would be wintering amidst the rocks of Formiae, the sands and swamps of Liternum, and throughout the inhospitable woodlands. And it did not escape Hannibal's notice that his own strategy was being turned against him. He could not make his way through by way of Casilinum. He would have to head for the hills and cross the heights of Calicula. Fearing that the Romans might attack his column while it was hemmed in by the valleys, Hannibal thought up a frightening optical illusion to baffle his enemy, and decided to approach the hills furtively during the early hours of the night. His stratagem was set up as follows. Combustible material was collected from all the surrounding fields, and Hannibal had this, together with bunches of twigs and dry vine shoots, attached to the horns of cattle. He had a large number of these, both domesticated and wild, amongst the spoils taken from the countryside. The total came to some 2,000 head. Hasdrubal was given responsibility for driving the herd at night towards the hills, with their horns alight, and especially, if he could, over the passes occupied by the enemy. 17. When darkness fell, the Carthaginians silently broke camp, and the cattle were driven at some distance ahead of the main body of the army. Yeah, it's the army. When they reached the foothills and the narrow defiles, a signal was immediately given for the horns to be lit, and the cattle driven up the hills facing them. The very panic instilled in them by the flames that flashed from their heads, and the burning that went to the quick at the roots of their horns, drove them into a frenzy. There was an immediate stampede, and it was as if all the brushwood in the area was aflame. With woods and hills set on fire, the beasts shook their heads in vain, merely fanning the flames, and thus created the illusion of men rushing about in all directions. Those stationed to guard the pass could see fires on the hilltops, and some right above their heads. Thinking they were surrounded, they abandoned their posts. They headed for the hilltops, where the blazing flames were least concentrated, assuming this to be the safest path. But even so, they ran into a number of cattle that had strayed away from their herd, and when they first saw them in the distance, they froze, astounded by the miraculous sight of animals apparently breathing fire. Then it dawned on them that it was a trick and man-made, and thinking it was an ambush, they beat a hasty retreat in even greater panic. They also encountered some enemy light-armed infantry, but the darkness spread fear equally on both sides, and kept them there till dawn, with neither opening hostilities. Meanwhile, Hannibal brought his entire column through the pass, taking a number by surprise in the pass itself, and encamped in the region of LIVY.